In mid-1994, a solitary programmer sat alone in an office at Interplay Entertainment, tinkering with an isometric engine that no one else cared about. For 6 months, Tim Kaine worked in isolation on what management considered a waste of company resources. They called it a B-tier project. They assigned problem employees to it. They nearly cancelled it 3 separate times. Yet from this neglected corner of the gaming industry emerged one of the most influential role-playing games ever created, a post-nuclear masterpiece that would redefine what choice and consequence meant in interactive entertainment. The story of Fallout's creation begins not with grand ambition or corporate backing, but with quiet persistence in the face of institutional indifference. In mid-1993, fresh off completing work on Rags to Riches, Tim Kaine found himself with spare time and a creative itch that needed scratching. Rather than wait for his next official assignment, he began experimenting with game engines during hours when he was nominally supposed to be working on something else entirely. His official job title included making game installers, mundane work that left his mind free to wander toward more interesting problems. Kaine created 3 separate engines during this experimental period. The first was a voxel engine, an attempt to render 3-dimensional space using volume elements rather than polygons. The second was a fully 3-dimensional engine, pushing against the technical limitations of mid-90s hardware. But it was the third engine, a 2-dimensional isometric sprite system, that truly captured his imagination. Something about the perspective felt right, reminiscent of classic computer role-playing games, but with room for innovation. At the time, Kaine was deeply involved in tabletop gaming, playing pen and paper sessions of GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system, 2 or 3 evenings each week with a group of friends. The system's flexibility and emphasis on character customization resonated with him. In 1991, he had already created a GURPS character editor for personal use, a tool that let him quickly generate and modify characters for his gaming sessions. Now, with his new isometric engine taking shape, an idea began to form. What if he could combine the tactical flexibility of GURPS with the visual appeal of an asymmetric game world? The prototype was crude by any standard, little more than a knight walking around an isometric landscape. But it represented something more than the sum of its parts. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that the engine could support movement, animation, and potentially combat. Kaine began showing his work to colleagues during after-hours sessions, trying to generate interest in what was still essentially a side project with no official sanction. Slowly, almost organically, people began to gravitate toward the project. The game had no formal development process at Interplay. It simply grew, collecting interested developers like a snowball rolling downhill. Designer and programmer Jason Taylor was one of the first to come aboard, joining Kaine sometime in late 1993 or early 1994. By Christmas 1994, the team consisted of exactly 3 people: Kaine, Taylor, and artist-designer Jason Anderson. Leonard Boyarsky, who would later become one of the franchise's most important creative voices, hadn't yet joined the project. The work was done largely in secret, or at least in the margins of official company business. Interplay's management showed little interest in the growing project, which proved both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the lack of oversight allowed Kaine and his small team tremendous creative freedom. They could experiment with systems and ideas without corporate interference or demands to chase current market trends. On the other hand, the lack of support meant constant uncertainty about whether the project would survive long enough to become a shippable product. During this early phase, Kaine managed to convince Brian Fargo, Interplay's president, that the engine had real potential. Fargo, to his credit, recognized something valuable in what Kane was building, even if the rest of the company's management remained skeptical. In 1994, Interplay officially announced that it had acquired the license to use the GURP system for an upcoming game. This was Fallout's first public acknowledgement, though it wouldn't bear that name for another 2 years. The tentative title at this stage was Vault 13, a GURPS post-nuclear role-playing game. Even in this early iteration, the core concept was taking shape. Players would emerge from an underground vault into a post-apocalyptic wasteland, tasked with finding a replacement water chip to save their home. The quest would force them to navigate a world populated by mutants, raiders, and the remnants of civilization, making difficult choices that would determine not just their survival but their moral character. The name Vault 13 didn't last long. Beyond being unwieldy, it presented obvious problems for any potential sequels. What would a follow-up be called? Vault 13 Part 2? Vault 14? More Vault 13? The team recognized the limitation and began brainstorming alternatives. Interplay was already working on another project that planned to use the title Armageddon, so that option was off the table despite being a favourite among some team members. On June 19, 1996, Kane called a 90-minute brainstorming session where the development team threw out every name that came to mind, no matter how outlandish or inappropriate. The list included everything from serious suggestions to outright jokes. Eventually, Brian Fargo proposed the title Fallout, a reference to the radioactive debris and residual radiation that follows a nuclear detonation. It was simple, evocative, and carried the right connotations of consequence and aftermath. The name stuck immediately. The project officially became Fallout. Post-nuclear role-playing game, but Fallout's connection to nuclear apocalypse didn't emerge from nowhere. The game was always intended as a spiritual successor to Wasteland, a post-apocalyptic computer role-playing game that Interplay had developed and Electronic Arts had published back in 1988. Wasteland had been a significant success for its time, shifting approximately 250,000 copies when anything over 100,000 was considered exceptional for a computer game. The game featured a grim, darkly humorous take on life after World War III, with players controlling a party of desert rangers navigating the irradiated ruins of the American Southwest. Both Interplay and Electronic Arts had wanted to create sequels to Wasteland, capitalizing on its success. EA greenlit Fountain of Dreams as a direct sequel, while Interplay began work on a different follow-up called Meantime. However, creative differences and business complications led to both projects being cancelled. EA owned the Wasteland intellectual property, having published the original game, and they showed no interest in licensing it back to Interplay for future development. Brian Fargo and his team at Interplay found themselves in a frustrating position. They had the expertise and the desire to make another post-apocalyptic game, but they couldn't legally use the Wasteland name, setting, or specific characters. Rather than abandon the concept entirely, they decided to create something new that captured the spirit of Wasteland while establishing its own distinct identity. This decision would prove creatively liberating. Without the constraints of existing lore and characters, the team could build something entirely their own. Under Fergus Urquhart's leadership, Interplay formed an internal division called Black Isle Studios, specifically focused on developing role-playing games. Fallout would be Black Isle's first major project, though the studio name wouldn't be formally applied until during the development of Fallout 2. The team began analysing what had made Wasteland successful, identifying the core elements that resonated with players. The post-nuclear setting, the moral ambiguity of choices, the dark humour amid devastation, and the sense of exploring a world where civilization's collapse revealed both the worst and best of human nature. With these touchstones established, the team began building outward, creating a new post-apocalyptic world that would feel familiar to Wasteland fans, while establishing its own unique identity. Designer Chris Taylor cited several key influences that shaped Fallout's tone and aesthetic. The 1959 novel A Canticle for Leibowitz, Walter M. Miller Jr.'s Meditation on Cyclical Destruction, and the preservation of knowledge through dark ages provided philosophical depth. The film Mad Max 2, known in the United States as The Road Warrior, offered visual inspiration for the Wasteland's savage frontier society. The 1995 French film The City of Lost Children contributed to the game's surreal, slightly off-kilter atmosphere. But perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Fallout's aesthetic came from an unexpected source: the optimistic futurism of 1950s America. The team embraced what would later be called atom punk or retrofuturism, imagining an alternate timeline where the cultural aesthetic of the post-World War II era persisted for decades. In Fallout's world, the 1950s never really ended. The fashion, architecture, and design sensibility of that era dominated American culture well into the 21st century, even as technology advanced in strange directions. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. The juxtaposition of naive optimism and nuclear annihilation created a powerful thematic resonance. The 1950s were defined by two contradictory impulses: unbridled faith in technological progress and atomic terror. Families were told to believe in a bright scientific future where household robots and flying cars would make life easy, while simultaneously being drilled in nuclear attack preparedness and building backyard fallout shelters. Fallout literalized this contradiction. The future arrived, and it brought devastation. Vault-Tec, the fictional corporation that built the underground vaults, where survivors sheltered from the bombs, became the perfect embodiment of this twisted optimism. Their propaganda materials, cheerful mascots, and corporate doublespeak presented nuclear war as merely an inconvenience to be weathered underground with proper preparation. The famous Vault Boy mascot, giving a thumbs up with a perpetual smile, represented everything absurd about trying to sanitize apocalypse. His cheerful demeanor in the face of radiation, dismemberment, and death became one of gaming's most recognizable images. The team worked hard to establish what they called a sensibilities document, a touchstone that defined what Fallout was and wasn't. Brian Fargo later explained that this document spoke to points like moral ambiguity, tactical combat, a skills-based character system, and meaningful attributes. These weren't just gameplay features. They were philosophical commitments about what kind of experience the game would deliver. Moral ambiguity particularly mattered to the designers. They wanted a world where right and wrong weren't always clear, where the good choice might have terrible consequences and the bad choice might be necessary for survival. This commitment to moral complexity would manifest in quests that refused to provide clear heroes and villains. A town might need help, but the people asking for help might be asking you to commit atrocities. A character might seem evil but have understandable motivations. The player might solve a problem peacefully only to discover that violence would have produced a better outcome. This ambiguity wasn't cynicism for its own sake. It reflected the team's belief that interesting role-playing emerged from difficult choices, not obvious ones. As the team expanded through 1995 and into 1996, Fallout slowly began resembling something the site actually shipped. A team photo from around August 1995 showed just 9 people. By mid-1996, that number had grown to 11. These weren't massive teams by any standard. For comparison, Baldur's Gate would later employ dozens of developers and modern games like Baldur's Gate 3 would require nearly 500 people. Fallout was being built by a skeleton crew, often working on the project while nominally assigned to other duties. Leonard Boyarsky joined during this expansion phase and quickly became one of the project's most important creative voices. His artistic vision helped define Fallout's visual style, from the iconic Vault Boy to the game's UI elements. The character design work he contributed gave the world's inhabitants a distinctive look that balanced cartoon exaggeration with grim realism. The super mutants in particular benefited from his touch, looking both monstrous and pitiable in ways that supported the narrative's themes. The technology itself presented constant challenges. In 1996, computer gaming was transitioning from sprite-based graphics to full three-dimensional environments. Games like Quake were demonstrating what was possible with polygon-based rendering, and there was considerable pressure within the industry to embrace 3D graphics as the future. The Fallout team seriously considered making a fully three-dimensional game, but ultimately decided against it. The limitations of mid-90s 3D graphics meant that the kind of detail and expressiveness they wanted simply wasn't achievable yet. Instead, they doubled down on the isometric perspective, using it to their advantage. The fixed camera angle allowed for pre-rendered backgrounds with far more detail than real-time 3D could manage. Characters and objects existed as sprites, carefully animated frame by frame to provide smooth movement. The result was a game that looked distinctive and timeless rather than attempting to compete with emerging 3D titles on their own terms. For character close-ups during dialogue, the team developed an innovative solution using practical effects rather than relying on digital character models. They sculpted physical talking heads from clay, representing major characters who needed detailed facial expressions. These clay sculptures were then scanned, textured, and animated frame by frame. The process was labor-intensive and required significant artistic skill, but it produced results that sprite-based character portraits couldn't match. 21 characters in the final game received the talking head treatment, their faces capable of conveying emotion with surprising effectiveness for mid-90s technology. The decision to use physical models also gave Fallout a distinctive aesthetic quality that set it apart from competitors. The talking heads had a slightly uncanny appearance, not quite realistic but expressive enough to convey personality. Characters like the Master, Harold, and the various merchants and quest givers became memorable partly because players could see their faces react during conversations. This investment in character presentation supported the game's emphasis on dialogue and choice, but even as the game's artistic vision crystallized, a catastrophic business problem threatened to derail the entire project. In February 1997, with the game deep into development and scheduled for a summer release, Interplay's partnership with Steve Jackson Games collapsed. The company that owned the GURP system formally terminated the licensing agreement, pulling the foundation out from under Fallout's character system. The game engine, quests, dialogue, and artwork were all built around GURPS mechanics. Suddenly, none of that could be legally used. The split stemmed from creative differences over the game's violence and gore. Interplay had shown Steve Jackson Games the game's opening cinematic, a darkly humorous sequence where a prisoner is executed by being shot in the head while waving cheerfully at the camera. Jackson reportedly found the sequence distasteful and objected to the level of violence throughout the game. Brian Fargo, knowing that Fallout's brutal world was central to its identity and that the opening scene was merely a warm-up to the harsh realities players would encounter, made the decision to terminate the licensing deal rather than compromise the vision. This created an immediate crisis. Fallout was scheduled to release in just months. The entire character system, which controlled everything from combat calculations to skill checks to dialogue options, was built on GURPS mechanics that Interplay no longer had the legal right to use. Ripping out the foundation and replacing it with something else in such a short time frame seemed impossible. Many projects would have been cancelled at this point. The safer business decision would have been to write off the sunk costs and move resources to less risky ventures. Instead, Tim Kaine and Chris Taylor were each given 1 week. Taylor had 1 week to design a completely new character system that could replace GURPS while maintaining the depth and flexibility that made the original system work. Kaine had 1 week to program and implement that system into the game engine, replacing every instance where GURPS mechanics were referenced. They were being asked to accomplish in 2 weeks what normally would have taken months of careful development and testing. The system they created in this crucible became one of gaming's most beloved character systems. Special, an acronym for strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck, replaced GURPS's more granular attributes with 7 core stats that were easier to understand but still offered meaningful differentiation. Each attribute affected multiple aspects of gameplay. Strength determined carry weight and melee damage. Perception affected accuracy and the ability to detect hidden objects. Charisma influenced how NPCs reacted and how many companions would follow the player. Intelligence controlled skill points and dialogue options. Agility affected action points in combat. Luck influenced critical hit chances and random encounters. Beyond the 7 attributes, the special system included skills, traits, and perks that allowed for deep character customization. Skills governed specific abilities like small guns, lockpicking, speech, and science. Traits were permanent, character quirks chosen at creation that provided both benefits and drawbacks. Perks were special abilities earned as the character leveled up, representing major improvements or unique capabilities. The system was elegant in its simplicity, while offering enormous depth for character building. More importantly, special worked. Despite being created under crushing time pressure, the system held together mechanically and supported the kind of varied playstyles the team wanted to enable. A character could be built for combat proficiency, social manipulation, stealth, or technical expertise. The system didn't force players into predefined classes. Instead, it provided tools and let players decide how to specialize. The frantic 2-week replacement of GURPS with Special ended up being one of the best things that happened to Fallout, giving it a signature system that would define the franchise for decades. This near disaster was far from the only threat to Fallout's existence. According to Tim Kaine, the game faced 3 separate near cancellations during its development. Interplay's management consistently viewed the project as a poor use of resources, suggesting those resources would be better spent elsewhere. The company had acquired major licenses that seemed like safer bets, commercially. In late 1994, Interplay obtained the rights to make games based on Dungeons & Dragons, Forgotten Realms, and Planescape settings. These were established franchises with built-in audiences. Compared to them, Fallout was an unknown quantity with no guaranteed market. Tim Kaine later described having to personally convince management to let him continue work during these near cancellations. The project was considered a B-tier effort, and Kaine himself noted that employees with problems or difficulties were often assigned to Fallout rather than more prestigious projects. While Kaine emphasized that he found most of the employees fine to work with, and felt the real problem was their managers, the stigma of being the dumping ground for problem staff couldn't have helped the project's reputation within the company. the lack of formal development process actually became one of Fallout's defining characteristics. Without rigid structure or heavy management oversight, the team was free to experiment and iterate in ways that more controlled projects couldn't. The game grew organically, with features and content added as inspiration struck, rather than following a predetermined design document. This flexibility allowed the team to respond to what was working and abandon what wasn't without needing approval from layers of management. However, this freedom came at a cost. The project nearly collapsed in late 1994 when the Dungeons & Dragons licenses arrived. The project nearly collapsed again when the GURPS license fell through in early 1997. And it nearly collapsed a third time for reasons related to technical problems and market pressure. In early 1997, after Blizzard Entertainment released Diablo to enormous commercial success and critical acclaim, Interplay management pressured Kane to convert Fallout into a real-time multiplayer game similar to Diablo's model. Diablo had demonstrated that real-time action gameplay combined with role-playing elements could find massive audiences. Its randomly generated dungeons, emphasis on loot collection, and multiplayer capabilities made it perfect for sustained engagement. Executives saw dollar signs and wanted Fallout to chase the same market. For Kane and the team, this would have meant fundamentally gutting the game they had spent years building. Turn-based tactical, combat was central to Fallout's identity. The careful, deliberate decision-making in combat supported the game's emphasis on choice and consequence. Kane resisted this pressure, arguing that Fallout was designed around different strengths than Diablo. Where Diablo emphasized fast-paced action and repeated play sessions collecting randomized loot, Fallout focused on exploration, narrative, and character development. The two games appeal to different desires, and trying to turn Fallout into a Diablo clone would destroy what made it special without guaranteeing any of Diablo's success. This resistance required political capital and persuasive skill. Kane was fighting not just for his vision, but against the reasonable business logic that successful models should be replicated. The fact that Fallout survived these various threats speaks to the dedication of its development team and the occasional flashes of faith from Interplay's leadership. Brian Fargo, whatever his other faults, understood that original ideas had value and that homogenization of the market wasn't always the best strategy. His support proved crucial during moments when the project teetered on the edge of cancellation. Without his willingness to occasionally overrule his own management's recommendations, Fallout would have died quietly in 1994 or 1995, unknown and unmourned. As 1997 progressed and the game approached its planned summer release window, a new crisis emerged. A memory overflow bug was causing random crashes that the team couldn't reliably reproduce or fix. Memory management was always tricky in the mid-90s when computers had strictly limited RAM, and programmers needed to manually allocate and free memory. The bug appeared to be a buffer overflow somewhere in the code, meaning data was being written beyond the bounds of its allocated memory space. This type of bug could cause crashes, data corruption, or seemingly random behavior that was extremely difficult to track down. The summer release date came and went while the team hunted for the source of the crashes. Interplay couldn't ship a game that randomly crashed no matter how good the content was. Players wouldn't tolerate software that destroyed their save files or forced them to restart. The bug delayed Fallout for several crucial months, pushing the release into the autumn and testing everyone's patience. Tim Kane later revealed that this bug led to his bonus pay being cut by Brian Fargo as punishment for the delay, a decision that would have lasting consequences for Kane's relationship with Interplay. Eventually the bug was isolated and fixed. though not before causing considerable stress and adding to the development costs. The final budget for Fallout came to approximately $3 million, significant for the time though modest compared to modern game development. Interplay had employed up to 30 people on the project at various points, though the core team remained smaller. The final team photo from Nisa 7 showed 21 developers, a far cry from the solo effort that had started in 1993, but still tiny by industry standards. With the memory bug resolved, Fallout finally entered its Gold Master phase. The game was complete, tested, and ready to be manufactured and distributed. Interplay scheduled the release for October 1997, positioning it for the lucrative holiday shopping season. The company had high hopes, but tempered expectations. Brian Fargo later stated that the game had essentially no marketing campaign beyond encouraging fans to provide feedback on Interplay's website. Without a big promotional push, Fallout would have to sell itself through word of mouth and reviews. On September 30th, 1997, Fallout officially went gold, meaning the final version was approved for manufacture. The game launched in North America in October 1997 for DOS, Windows, and Macintosh platforms. Players who had been following computer role-playing games knew something different had arrived. The game's opening sequence set the tone immediately. Grainy footage showed pre-war America in all its naive optimism before cutting to the moment the bombs fell. Then came the image that would haunt players: a soldier in power armor executing a bound prisoner with a casual gunshot to the head, while the prisoner waved cheerfully at the camera. The prisoner's body crumpled, and the title appeared. This was not going to be a gentle experience. The game began properly in Vault 13, an underground shelter designed to protect its residents from the nuclear holocaust that had devastated the surface world. The year was 2161, 84 years after the Great War. The player character, who had come to be known as the Vault Dweller, lived a peaceful if monotonous existence in this sealed environment. The Vault's residents had everything they needed to survive indefinitely: recycling water, growing food in hydroponic gardens, and maintaining the equipment that kept them safe from the radiation-soaked wasteland above. Everything, that is, except a functioning water chip. The water chip was a crucial component in the Vault's water recycling and purification system. Without it, the Vault's water supply would be exhausted within months, forcing hundreds of people to either die of thirst or venture into the deadly wasteland. The Overseer, the Vault's leader, summoned the player character and delivered the game's central quest: travel to the surface, find a replacement water chip, and return before the water runs out. He estimated they had 150 days, though this deadline could be extended through certain actions. The quest seemed straightforward enough. It would prove anything but. Emerging from Vault 13 for the first time was a deliberate shock. The entrance was nestled in a mountainous region, with dead trees and rocky outcroppings stretching in all directions. The world map revealed the scope of the devastation. This wasn't just one destroyed city or region. The entire landscape had been transformed into a wasteland where survival was a daily struggle. Small settlements existed, but they were fragile and often brutal. Raiders, mutants, and irradiated creatures roamed freely. The pre-war world's infrastructure had crumbled into ruins that served as dangerous playgrounds for scavengers and monsters. The game's setting was Southern California, though players might not recognize it. Locations like Shady Sands, Junktown, the Hub, and the Boneyard represented post-nuclear interpretations of real places. The Boneyard was Los Angeles, its name grimly literal, referring to the skeletal remains of buildings and people that littered the ruins. The Hub was a trading center built from the remains of several towns, a rare place where commerce and something resembling civilization persisted. Shady Sands was a small farming community trying to build something sustainable amid the chaos. Each location presented its own problems, politics, and potential solutions. Shady Sands faced attacks from rad scorpions, mutated scorpions the size of dogs with venomous stings. The player could help defend the town, earning goodwill and potentially recruiting a companion. Junktown was ruled by a merchant named Killian Darkwater, opposed by a criminal named Gizmo, who controlled the town's casino and underworld. Players could support either faction or try to play them against each other. The hub's water merchants represented potential sources for a replacement water chip, though their prices were deliberately astronomical. The quest structure exemplified the moral ambiguity the team had committed to in their Sensibilities document. Helping one faction often meant betraying another. Solving a town's immediate problem might create long-term complications. The game tracked player actions through a karma system, measuring moral choices on a scale from saint to demon, but karma was descriptive rather than prescriptive. Low karma opened certain dialogue options and closed others. It affected how NPCs reacted and what quests became available. But the game never explicitly punished players for being evil or rewarded them for being good beyond these narrative consequences. The genius of Fallout's quest design was that multiple solutions existed for almost every problem. Violence was always an option, though often not the best one. Speech skills could diffuse confrontations or manipulate people into doing what you wanted. Technical skills like science, lockpicking, and repair opened alternative paths through obstacles. Stealth allowed avoiding encounters entirely. A player could theoretically complete the entire game without killing anyone, though doing so required careful planning and character building. Conversely, a murder-happy player could blast their way through every situation, though this approach closed off many quests and made the world increasingly hostile. Combat, when it occurred, used a turn-based system that gave Fallout a tactical depth unusual for role-playing games of its era. Each character had action points determined primarily by their agility attribute. Every action, from moving a single hex to firing a weapon to using an item, cost a specific number of action points. When a character ran out of points, their turn ended. This created meaningful decisions about resource allocation. Should you move into better cover or take another shot from your current position? Should you use a Stimpak now or trust that you can survive another round of enemy attacks? The combat system also featured targeted shots, allowing players to aim for specific body parts. Shooting an enemy in the leg might cripple them, reducing their movement. Shooting the arms could lower their accuracy or cause them to drop their weapon. Headshots did massive damage but were harder to hit. Eye shots were nearly impossible but could instantly kill if successful. This system added tactical variety and supported different combat styles. A patient sniper could take their time lining up devastating headshots. An aggressive brawler might target legs to prevent enemies from fleeing. The targeting system also contributed to the game's gore and dark humor, as successful shots could result in spectacularly violent deaths rendered in exaggerated, animated sequences. The character system allowed for enormous variety in playstyles. A character focused on speech could talk their way through situations that would be impossible for a combat-focused character. A character specializing in science and repair could hack computers and fix machinery, opening paths unavailable to others. Stealth characters could sneak past dangers entirely. The game supported pacifist runs, diplomacy-focused playthroughs, sneaky thief characters, brutal melee warriors, precision snipers, and everything in between. The player could also recruit companions to join them, though the companion system had both strengths and limitations. Companions were characters met throughout the wasteland who agreed to travel with the player for various reasons. Ian was a simple guard looking for adventure. Dogmeat was a dog who could be recruited in Junktown by wearing specific armor or having high charisma. Tycho was a desert ranger from the Nevada area, carrying forward the legacy of a wasteland's protagonist faction. Katya was a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse. The maximum number of companions depended on the player's charisma stat, with higher charisma allowing larger parties. However, companions were controlled by artificial intelligence rather than direct player commands. The player could set general tactical approaches like attacking everything, only attacking when attacked, or fleeing from combat. But the AI made its own decisions about targeting, movement, and ability usage. This autonomy frequently caused problems. Companions had no compunctions about shooting the player or each other if the player stood between them and their target. They would gleefully step into lines of fire, blow themselves up with grenades, or block doorways at critical moments. Many players learned to adventure alone after watching Ian accidentally kill himself with burst fire for the third time. The main quest eventually led players to discover that the water chip problem, while real and urgent, was merely the opening act of a larger crisis. Super mutants, massive green-skinned humanoids with strength far exceeding normal humans, were appearing throughout the wasteland in increasing numbers. These weren't random mutations caused by radiation. They were created through deliberate transformation, using a substance called Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. Someone was building an army of super mutants, and that someone had a plan for the wasteland's future that didn't include normal humans. The Master, the being orchestrating this transformation, was one of gaming's most memorable antagonists precisely because he defied simple villain categorization. Originally a human scientist named Richard Gray, he had been transformed into a grotesque fusion of human flesh and machine. His body melded with computer systems and other organic matter in a vault where FEV experimentation had gone catastrophically wrong. The transformation drove him mad, but not in ways that made him simply evil. The Master genuinely believed he was saving humanity. He saw the wasteland's radiation, disease, and violence, and concluded that normal humans were too weak to survive. By transforming everyone into super mutants, he would create a stronger, more unified species capable of thriving in the post-nuclear world. The final confrontation with the Master exemplified everything Fallout did differently. Players could fight him, certainly. The game provided a climactic battle if that was the solution they preferred. But combat wasn't the only option, or even the best one. A player with high speech skills could engage the Master in philosophical debate about his plans. More devastatingly, a player who had discovered certain information during their travels could present evidence that the Master's plan was fundamentally flawed. Super mutants were sterile, unable to reproduce. The Master's unity through transformation would last exactly 1 generation before his new species died out completely. Confronted with undeniable proof that his grand vision was impossible, the Master could be convinced to commit suicide, destroying himself and his army in a moment of crushing realization. This ending was more powerful than any combat victory could be. It transformed the climax from a test of stats and equipment into a philosophical and emotional confrontation. The Master wasn't simply defeated, he was broken by the truth, choosing oblivion over the knowledge that everything he had done was in service of a doomed dream. The game had multiple endings depending on player actions, with slides showing the fates of various settlements and characters, but every ending, regardless of the player's choices throughout the game, concluded with the Vault Dweller being exiled from Vault 13. The Overseer, recognizing that the player had become too changed by their experiences in the Wasteland, and fearing that they would inspire others to leave the Vault's safety, refused to allow them to return. The hero saved their home only to be cast out from it forever. Even victory was bittersweet, tinged with loss and exile. This ending perfectly encapsulated Fallout's commitment to moral complexity and consequences. The player had accomplished their mission. The water chip had been replaced, or the Vault's water needs had been resolved through other means. The super mutant threat had been eliminated. By any objective measure, the player had succeeded. Yet they couldn't go home. They had become something that didn't fit in Vault 13 anymore, too dangerous or too unsettling or simply too different. The Wasteland had claimed them, and there was no going back. Fallout was released on September 30th, 1997, into a gaming marketplace already crowded with strong titles. The timing placed it in direct competition with other major releases, and just months after Diablo had redefined what action role-playing games could be. Reviews arrived quickly and were overwhelmingly positive. Critics praised the game's open-ended nature, its character system, its commitment to choice and consequence, and its distinctive post-nuclear setting. The moral ambiguity of quests received particular acclaim. Reviewers noted that Fallout treated players as capable of making difficult decisions without hand-holding or obvious moral guidance. GameSpot awarded Fallout an 8.7 out of 10, praising its strengths while noting some clunky aspects. The review mentioned that interaction with non-player characters could be disappointing, with most NPCs not particularly conversational and running around somewhat inconsequentially. The companion AI also drew criticism for its tendency to block doorways or shoot the player and each other in the back during combat. Despite these quibbles, the review recognized that Fallout offered something distinctive and valuable, a role-playing game that genuinely let players forge their own path. Computer Games Magazine and GameSpot both awarded Fallout the title of Role-Playing Game of the Year for 1997, a remarkable achievement given that Final Fantasy VII had also released that same year to massive commercial success and critical acclaim. The Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences nominated Fallout at the Spotlight Awards, giving it recognition from industry peers. Metacritic, aggregating reviews from multiple sources, gave the game a Metascore of 89, indicating universal acclaim among critics. The awards and critical praise validated years of effort by the small team who had built the game under constant threat of cancellation. But critical success didn't automatically translate to commercial dominance. Fallout entered PC Data's sales rankings at number 12 for October 1997, a respectable showing but not the kind of chart-topping performance that would have made Interplay's executives immediately greenlight a sequel. The game sold 53,007 copies in the United States by the end of 1997, solid numbers that suggested a sustainable audience but not a breakout hit. Worldwide, over 100,000 copies had shipped by December 1997, and sales continued to grow through word of mouth and positive reviews. Eric Bethke reported sales of over 120,000 copies after a year on the market. By March 2000, 144,000 copies had been sold in the United States alone, and GameSpot estimated that worldwide figures were likely double that amount. The game eventually sold more than 500,000 copies globally, a success by any reasonable measure, even if it didn't achieve Diablo-level market penetration. The game's sales trajectory suggested something interesting about its audience. Fallout wasn't an impulse purchase for casual players attracted by heavy marketing. It was a game that found its audience through recommendations, reviews, and slowly building reputation. Players who tried it tended to love it and tell their friends. Communities formed around discussing optimal character builds, sharing stories of different playthroughs, and debating the ethical implications of various choices. Fallout had become a cult classic even while still actively selling. The financial performance was good enough that Interplay greenlit a sequel almost immediately. In fact, work on Fallout 2 had begun even before the first game shipped. A remarkable show of confidence from a company that had nearly cancelled the original multiple times. Tim Kaine announced Fallout 2 in early 1997 and wrote much of the sequel's story arc, though his involvement would be complicated by his deteriorating relationship with Interplay's management. The bonus cut related to the memory overflow bug had created resentment, and the pressure being applied to the franchise by sales and marketing departments made Kaine increasingly uncomfortable. In May 1998, just months into Fallout 2's development, Tim Kaine left Interplay. In interviews decades later, he explained that the departure stemmed from burnout and the bonus pay situation, feeling that he was being punished for technical problems beyond his control, while management made decisions that compromised the franchise's creative vision. Colleagues Jason D. Anderson and Leonard Boyarsky resigned along with him, a mass exodus of 3 of Fallout's key creative voices. The 3 would go on to found Troika Games in 1998, aiming to create role-playing games with the same creative freedom and focus on player choice that had characterized Fallout. Their first game, Arcanum, of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, would blend fantasy and industrial age technology in ways that echoed Fallout's retrofuturistic aesthetic. But that's another story. For Fallout itself, the loss of Kaine, Anderson, and Boyarsky meant that any sequel would have to proceed without the voices that had originally shaped its identity. Fallout 2 arrived in September 1998, developed by Black Isle Studios with Fergus Urquhart serving as producer and Matt Norton joining the design team. The sequel had been rushed through production in just 9 months due to Interplay's ongoing financial difficulties, resulting in a game that was bigger and more ambitious than its predecessor, but also noticeably rougher around the edges. Bugs were more prevalent, balance was less refined, and some content felt incomplete or hastily implemented. But the sequel also expanded the world, introduced memorable factions like the Enclave and New California Republic, and deepened the lore in ways that would define future games. The original Fallout's influence extended far beyond its immediate sequel. The game demonstrated that role-playing games didn't need to follow Dungeons & Dragons conventions. They could create original settings, embrace moral complexity, and trust players to forge their own narratives. The emphasis on choice and consequence, where different character builds opened entirely different paths through the game, became a benchmark that other developers tried to emulate. The retrofuturistic aesthetic became so strongly associated with Fallout that it's now instantly recognizable, influencing everything from other games to television shows to fashion. Mechanically, Fallout proved that turn-based tactical combat still had a place in gaming, even as the industry moved toward real-time action. The careful, deliberate decision-making in combat created tension and required strategic thinking in ways that real-time systems didn't. The targeted shot system, allowing players to aim for specific body parts with different effects, added tactical depth while also enabling the game's signature dark humor through exaggerated death animations. The character system, particularly after GURPS was replaced with Special, became one of gaming's most beloved progression systems. Its combination of attributes, skills, traits, and perks allowed for enormous variety in character building while remaining relatively simple to understand. Players could experiment with wildly different builds across multiple playthroughs, discovering new ways to approach familiar challenges. The system was so successful that it persisted through every subsequent Fallout game, becoming an essential part of the franchise's identity. The game's commitment to allowing non-violent playthroughs was revolutionary for its time and remains impressive today. By providing speech, science, lockpick, and other non-combat skills that could solve problems violence couldn't, Fallout made pacifist runs genuinely viable rather than theoretical curiosities. Players could talk their way past threats, hack terminals to disable security, sneak around dangers, or manipulate factions into fighting each other. The final confrontation with the Master could be resolved through dialogue rather than combat, making the climax of a pacifist playthrough just as dramatic and satisfying as any fighting build. The moral ambiguity in quests set a standard that games still struggle to match. Fallout didn't present players with obvious good and evil choices marked with glowing indicators. Instead, it offered situations where every option had costs and benefits, where helping one group meant hurting another, where the right choice wasn't always clear even in retrospect. The karma system tracked player actions but didn't enforce a particular moral path. Low karma characters weren't blocked from content or punished mechanically. They simply experienced different reactions from NPCs and had different opportunities available. This approach respected players' agency in ways that moral choice systems often don't. The game didn't lecture players about their decisions or force them to watch cutscenes, showing how their evil choices hurt innocent people. It simply presented consequences and let players live with them. A player who chose violence and cruelty would find the world reflecting that back at them. A player who chose compassion and diplomacy would see those effects ripple outward. Neither path was inherently better or worse from a gameplay perspective. They were simply different, offering distinct experiences. The post-nuclear setting, while drawing from established influences like Mad Max and A Canticle for Leibowitz, became distinctively Fallout through its embrace of 1950s Americana. The retrofuturistic aesthetic wasn't just window dressing, it served thematic purposes, highlighting the gap between optimistic visions of the future and the reality of nuclear devastation. Vault-Tech's cheerful corporate propaganda, presented through training films and posters, created cognitive dissonance with the horrors players encountered. The Vault Boy mascot's permanent smile became darkly ironic as players discovered the atrocities committed in the name of preserving civilization. The environmental storytelling in Fallout set standards that the industry would spend years learning to match. Players could piece together stories of what happened before and after the bombs by examining skeletons, reading computer terminals, and observing the state of abandoned buildings. A skeleton clutching a teddy bear in what used to be a child's room told a story without a single word of dialogue. Computer logs in military installations revealed the escalating paranoia and resource wars that led to nuclear exchange. Graffiti and environmental damage showed how survivors had tried to adapt to the new reality. The dark humour threading through the game was crucial to making the setting work. Without moments of absurdity and gallows humour, the relentless grimness of post-nuclear wasteland would have been overwhelming. But the humour was never mean-spirited toward the setting or the characters. It emerged naturally from the juxtaposition of pre-war optimism with post-war reality, from the absurdity of trying to maintain civilization's niceties amid apocalypse, from the resilience of human beings who found ways to laugh even in the darkest times. Technically, the game pushed the limits of what was possible with mid-90s hardware while making smart compromises that kept it accessible. The isometric perspective and sprite-based graphics meant the game could run on a wider range of systems than cutting-edge 3D games. The Talking Heads technology, using scanned clay models rather than fully animated 3D characters, achieved expressiveness that would have been impossible with the polygon counts available at the time. The decision to use Mark Morgan's ambient soundtrack rather than constant musical accompaniment created atmosphere without overwhelming the sound design. Interplay originally wanted to use I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots as the theme song, but copyright issues prevented this. Instead, they used another Ink Spots song, Maybe, which appeared in the game's intro and ending. The choice of 1950s music reinforced the retro-futuristic aesthetic, while also highlighting the tragedy of the setting. These songs represented hope, romance, and dreams of a bright future, all rendered bitterly ironic by the nuclear devastation that followed. The game underwent censorship in certain international versions, particularly in Europe, where all children were removed from some versions. This decision, made to avoid controversy in markets with strict content rating systems, actually damaged the game's narrative impact. Part of Fallout's moral weight came from the presence of children in the wasteland, reminders that the bombs hadn't discriminated and that new generations were being born into horror. Removing them sanitized the wasteland in ways that undermined the game's themes. Fallout spawned a passionate community that remained active for years after release. Fan sites like No Mutants Allowed became hubs for discussion, strategy guides, and eventually advocacy for preserving the franchise's original identity, when later games diverged from the formula. These fans were notoriously protective of what they saw as Fallout's core elements: isometric perspective, turn-based combat, deep role-playing mechanics, and dark humor balanced with serious themes. When the franchise eventually moved to first-person perspective and real-time combat under Bethesda's stewardship, these communities vigorously debated whether the changes constituted evolution or betrayal. The debate over what makes something truly Fallout continues to this day. Is it the isometric perspective and turn-based combat? Is it the retro-futuristic aesthetic and dark humor? Is it the moral ambiguity and emphasis on choice? Is it simply the post-nuclear setting and special character system? Different. Fans prioritize different elements, and the franchise's evolution has been a continuous negotiation between preserving core identity and adapting to new technologies and player expectations. In retrospect, Fallout's greatest achievement might be proving that a small team with limited resources could create something that resonated deeply and lasted for decades. 21 people in a final team photo, 3.5 years of development, $3 million in total costs, 3 near cancellations. These constraints might have doomed a less passionate project. Instead, they created focus. Every element had to justify its existence. Every system had to serve the core vision. There was no room for bloat or feature creep. Everything in the final game was there because someone fought for it, believed in it, and made it work despite limited time and resources. The game's creation story, with Tim Kaine working alone for 6 months before anyone joined him, before management even knew the project existed in any real form, speaks to the power of individual vision pursued with dedication. But it also speaks to the collaborative nature of game development. Kaine couldn't have finished Fallout alone. He needed artists like Leonard Boyarsky, designers like Chris Taylor and the other 18 people who appear in that final team photo. He needed Brian Fargo's occasional willingness to overrule his own management's desire to cancel the project. He needed the freedom that came from institutional neglect, allowing the team to experiment without interference. The legacy of the original Fallout lives on in ways that extend far beyond direct sequels. Its influence can be seen in games like Wasteland 2 and 3, spiritual successors that carried forward the turn-based tactical gameplay and post-nuclear setting. It influenced the design philosophy of games like Planescape, Torment, which took Fallout's emphasis on narrative choice and pushed it even further. The special system appeared in modified forms across multiple games. The retro-futuristic aesthetic became a recognized art style beyond gaming. In 2004, Bethesda Softworks acquired the Fallout intellectual property from Interplay for $5.75 million, a remarkably modest sum that likely reflected Interplay's desperate financial situation more than the franchise's actual value. Under Bethesda's stewardship, Fallout transformed from an isometric RPG into a first-person action game, using the same engine and design philosophy that had made the Elder Scrolls series successful. Fallout 3, released in 2008, introduced the franchise to a massive new audience, while generating fierce debate among fans of the original games about whether the changes preserved or destroyed what made Fallout special. Tim Cain himself had mixed reactions to Fallout 3. He praised Bethesda's understanding of Fallout lore and their successful adaptation of the special system to first-person shooter mechanics, but he criticized certain aspects of the humor and what he saw as excessive recycling of story elements from the earlier games. His measured response reflected someone who understood that franchises evolve and that his own work had become part of something larger than his original vision, even as he maintained standards for what the franchise should represent. When Obsidian Entertainment, founded by former Black Isle developers including Fergus Urquhart, got the opportunity to create Fallout, New Vegas using Bethesda's engine, many original Fallout fans saw it as a return to the franchise's roots. New Vegas emphasized player choice, moral ambiguity, and faction-based conflicts in ways that felt more aligned with the original game's design philosophy. Tim Cain later stated that he thought New Vegas was the most Fallouty of the post-original games, particularly in terms of humor, and that the Obsidian designers understood and respected the franchise. The franchise's success has now extended beyond gaming. The Fallout television series released by Amazon in 2024 demonstrated that the post-nuclear setting and retrofuturistic aesthetic could work in other media. The show's success led to renewed interest in all the games, with player counts across the series doubling or tripling on Steam. On September 30th, 2017, the 20th anniversary of Fallout's release, Bethesda gave away the original game for free on Steam for a single day, allowing a new generation to experience where it all began. Looking back from decades later, it's remarkable that Fallout exists at all. So many things had to go right for this game to survive development and reach players. Tim Cain had to spend 6 months working alone on an engine during time when he was supposed to be doing something else. Brian Fargo had to see potential in that early prototype and defend it against 3 separate attempts to cancel the project. The team had to weather the loss of the GURPS license and create a replacement system in 2 weeks. They had to resist pressure to transform the game into a Diablo clone. They had to find and fix a game-breaking memory bug without giving up. Every obstacle could have ended the project, yet somehow it survived each one. The game that emerged from this gauntlet of near disasters was rough in places. The companion AI was frustrating. Some interface elements were clunky. Balance issues made certain builds significantly more effective than others. The time limit on the water chip quest created unnecessary stress for some players. These flaws were real and noticeable, products of a small team working under severe time and resource constraints. Yet they couldn't diminish what Fallout achieved. For players in 1997 tired of fantasy settings and binary moral choices, Fallout offered something genuinely different. Here was a game that respected intelligence, rewarded creativity, and refused to hold hands through difficult decisions. It presented a world where violence was always possible but rarely the best solution, where speech and intelligence could be just as powerful as strength and agility. It told stories about survival, identity, and what humanity becomes when civilization collapses. It did all this, with a distinctive visual style, memorable characters, and humour dark enough to match the setting. The game asked difficult questions without providing easy answers. What does it mean to preserve humanity? Is the master wrong that humans need to be transformed to survive, or just wrong about the method? When does protecting your community require exiling those who have changed too much? Can civilization be rebuilt, or will the wasteland's brutality corrupt every attempt? Is it better to die human, or live as something else? The game didn't answer these questions definitively. It simply posed them through the situations it created and let players work through the implications. This philosophical ambition, combined with mechanical depth and aesthetic distinctiveness, explains Fallout's enduring influence. The game demonstrated that role-playing games could be more than power fantasies or dungeon crawls. They could be spaces for exploring complex themes, for making difficult choices with real consequences, for building unique characters that approach the same challenges in radically different ways. They could trust players to create their own narratives within the framework the game provided. Fallout wasn't the first game to emphasize player choice. It wasn't the first post-apocalyptic game. It wasn't the first to use isometric perspective or turn-based combat. But it combined these elements with a confidence and coherence that felt revolutionary. Everything reinforced everything else. The retro-futuristic aesthetic supported the thematic focus on the gap between optimism and reality. The moral ambiguity in quests supported the character system's flexibility. The turn-based combat supported the tactical approach to problem-solving. The dark humour made the grimness bearable while highlighting the absurdity of nuclear war. Each piece strengthened the whole. The game's impact on the role-playing genre cannot be overstated. It proved that original intellectual properties could succeed without relying on established licenses. It showed that small teams could create experiences that resonated as deeply as big-budget productions. It demonstrated that players appreciated being treated as capable of handling complex narratives without guidance systems and moral compasses telling them what to think. These lessons influenced a generation of developers who grew up playing Fallout and wanted to create games with similar depth and player respect. Tim Kane's YouTube channel, started in 2023, has provided unprecedented insight into Fallout's development and the challenges the team faced. His videos discussing the game's creation reveal a project that succeeded despite rather than because of institutional support. The stories he shares about working on problem employees, facing near cancellations and creating special in 2 weeks, humanize the development process in ways that make Fallout's success seem even more improbable. These weren't industry giants with unlimited resources. They were passionate developers fighting to create something they believed in. The game industry has changed dramatically since 1997. Modern RPGs often employ hundreds of developers and take years to create. Marketing budgets can exceed development costs. Games as a service models emphasize continuous engagement over complete, self-contained experiences. In this environment, Fallout stands as a reminder of a different era when a small team could create something enduring without massive infrastructure or ongoing monetization strategies. The game was complete when it shipped. It didn't need patches to be playable or downloadable content to feel whole. It was what it was, take it or leave it, and that confidence in the finished product feels increasingly rare. Yet Fallout also demonstrates that good design transcends technical limitations. The game's graphics are dated by modern standards, the interface shows its age, the AI makes frustrating decisions. None of this prevents the core experience from remaining compelling. The writing, the quest design, the character system, the atmospheric world building, these elements haven't aged because they were never dependent on cutting-edge technology. They were the products of creativity, intelligence, and commitment to a coherent vision. Those qualities remain timeless. For players discovering Fallout today, the experience requires adjusting expectations. This is not a modern game with quality-of-life features and forgiving design. It is brutal, occasionally opaque, and willing to let players fail without safety nets. The initial learning curve is steep. The game does not explain all its systems clearly. Mistakes can have permanent consequences. Character builds can be dead ends that only become apparent hours into a playthrough. This uncompromising design is part of what made Fallout special to its original audience, but it can be off-putting to players accustomed to more accessible games. The original Fallout represents a specific moment in gaming history when developers were still discovering what interactive storytelling could be. The technology had advanced enough to support complex narratives and meaningful choices, but hadn't yet standardized around specific genres or formulas. There was room for experimentation, for trying approaches that might not work, for building experiences that didn't fit neatly into marketing categories. Fallout emerged from this experimental space, carrying the marks of its tumultuous development, but also the benefits of relative creative freedom. Whether we will see another game quite like the original Fallout is an open question. The industry has moved toward larger teams, bigger budgets, and more risk-averse development strategies. Original intellectual properties are harder to sell than established franchises. Turn-based combat is considered niche compared to real-time action. The kind of institutional neglect that allowed Fallout to develop without interference is rare when every project requires justification to shareholders and corporate oversight. Yet indie developers and smaller studios continue drawing inspiration from Fallout's example. Games like Underrail, Atom RPG, and Wasteland 2 and 3 prove that audiences still exist for isometric, turn-based role-playing games with deep character systems and emphasis on player choice. Disco Elysium, while set in a very different world, inherited Fallout's commitment to allowing non-violent playthroughs and treating dialogue as a legitimate alternative to combat. These spiritual successors keep alive the design philosophy that Fallout pioneered. The original Fallout endures not because it was perfect, but because it was bold. It took risks that could have destroyed it, and emerged with something distinctive and memorable. It trusted players to handle moral complexity without judgment or hand-holding. It built a world rich enough to support decades of sequels, spin-offs, and adaptations. It proved that a small team with limited resources but unlimited passion could create something that would influence gaming for generations. In the wasteland of video game history, Fallout stands as a monument to what creativity, persistence, and a little bit of luck can achieve against overwhelming odds. War may never change, but Fallout changed gaming forever.